Hello and welcome to another patch from scratch. Today we'll be looking at a preset from my new preset pack, District 0 Volume 2, 86 Cyberpunk themed presets for Massive. So far the reception has been great. People who've used it said they like it a whole lot. So I've wanted to do a few tutorials to, share my design process for some of these sounds. And the one I'd like to look at today is this one called Broken Memories. I'll just give you a quick preview of what it can do, and then we'll dive right into it. So as you can hear, this preset can do a whole lot of things, but it's actually quite simple. Instead of building it completely from scratch, I will start with most things turned off, and I'll slowly add elements to the patch and explain my reasoning of doing so and how it affects the sound. So here I am with most things turned off, and what we're left with is just this. It's just a simple sine wave with a slight bit of pitch modulation being applied to it, which is honestly not that interesting. We can change the speed of the modulation and change the modulation shape. But again, it's not that interesting. So to make it more interesting, we actually have to increase our voices that we use. So we do that by going to this voicings tab, going over to the unisono, which basically just means how many voices do you want playing at once when you play a key, and I've had it set to 3. And already you can hear there's a whole lot more happening. So why is this? This is happening because since we're generating 3 voices, we tell Massive to take this one oscillator that we're using, generated 3 times, and our LFO that we're using is not set to mono. This is very important because if it were set to mono, we'd be back to this. This means that if it were set to mono, then each of our 3 LFOs being applied for 3 voices of our one oscillator, they would all start at exactly this point the moment I hit a key. But if it's not set to mono, then we can have 3 independent versions. Well, not quite independent, but essentially it means that our 3 generated LFOs will not all start at this point. Basically, they're just going and going and going until I hit a key, and they all do their thing. Now, since this is just a sine wave, as you might know, if you take 2 sine waves and put them together, and one is slightly faster or slightly slower, then you will get phase cancellation effects. That means that if you have one sine wave going like this, but another sine wave going like this, then they will essentially cancel each other out. Now, since they are being modulated from different points, meaning our 3 voices will never have the same pitch at the same time, you get these tremolo-like effects. So that's the first step of designing our sound. For the next step, to make this a bit more interesting than just a start and stop sound, we can add some delay, be generous with our feedback time and our dry-wet value. And already we have a very nice stereo field. This delay is basically just enhancing what is happening here with our three voices, because it takes those three voices and plays them back again, which means we have even more voices going on at the same time and more possible cancellation happening. And to emphasize this, we can also use some reverb. Delay and reverb always goes nice together. Which essentially just makes it a bit more ambient, a bit more pushed to the back, or I should say less in your face. So next up, let's look at our modulation oscillator. I'm just using one of those modes. It's the ring modulator being applied to our first three sine wave voices here. Now, ring modulation is a bit tricky to understand. I'm still struggling with it. I can kind of expect what kind of sounds will come from it, but most of the time it's trial and error. If we look at this pitch here, this is not just some number. This is also an oscillator going at this pitch, but it's not being output. It's being applied to this one. And for ring modulation, I think what the output of a ring modulator gives you the difference between two voices. So I'm sure a lot of you math experts and music engineers can probably answer this better of what it actually does. So if we turn this on, and let me put this to 0 for a moment. So now this is the exact same pitch as this one. And if we turn this all the way up, we get pretty much a voice above, an octave above, which in itself is not that interesting. But what you can do is, if we offset this one a tiny bit, and you can set this to taste, totally up to you, then we get even more differences between our original pitch being modulated once, being modulated again. Oh, that's funny. I didn't actually know that. For some reason, now that I'm turning this up, we are getting some sub-frequencies. Again, this is some math stuff going on, not exactly my forte. All I know is by offsetting this, we can get more modulation, we can get more variation in a patch, which is always something we want, because listening to the same wavetable, the same sound for a long period of time, it gets old very quickly. So if you're designing sounds yourself, it's always a good idea to ask yourself, what can I do to bring in more variation? So I had this set at -4, -0.4, which is not the most important thing of this patch. I could set this to like this or this or this. It doesn't really matter. It's a trial error. It sounded good, whatever. I just left it. But what I do have is two more interesting things. First of all, I didn't set this to 100%. Because it's more interesting to hear a mixture of both instead of hearing none or hearing only what the ring modulator is outputting. So I set this kind of to 50. And you see this yellow R, which you can get from here. If you pull this yellow cross to anywhere, this is a random, basically this is a randomizer modulator. And myself, I found this way late in years after using Massive. I had no idea this existed. But if you put this on any of these controls, then inside of this frame, it will generate a random value anytime a voice is played. Which again brings us more variation, because every voice is just a tiny bit different than the one before. It's very unlikely that you'll play two notes with the exact same value. Now for the pitch, I have one envelope going for about 2 semitones. And don't mind the point -4, totally random, is not by design, but it works. So let's have a look at envelope 3. This is just nothing exciting going on. It's an envelope with a generous attack, so it doesn't happen immediately. A generous decay, 0 sustain. Oh, wrong one. 0 sustain and, you know, a normal. I think this is the, nope. Yeah, slightly longer release. It's not that important. But what this does is essentially it gives us a bit more variation at the start of a note, and then it settles back into like a normal value. You don't have to do this. It's totally fine not having it, but I think it works, so why not? And here I have another randomizer set to sidechain mode. So you get sidechain mode by clicking this little SC. So now this is not modulation being applied, but rather this modulation is, or this modulator is modulating how much of this modulator is being applied. So what this means is anytime I hit a note, it will choose a random value between 0 and 2.04 to apply to this pitch of this ring modulator. So next up, let's have a look at our filters. Now I have these filters set to serial mode, and the mix is set to 100% filter 2, which means we will only hear signal that has been applied by this filter first, and then by this filter. Now the reason I did that is, well, first of all, let me just start with one. So let's start with this comb filter. Already we're getting some more weirdness. So what's happening here is a comb filter, also again, a quest for you engineering nerds, feel free to explain this in better terms. But a comb filter I see in a way as a resonator to a sound. If you double click the pitch, then it will jump to the value where it has the exact same pitch as our 0.0 oscillator, which will essentially just make the sound louder. But since we have this pitch modulation going on, we have more stuff happening just above and just below our main frequency. So for that reason, I put another LFO on this pitch control, and it looks like this. It's pretty much the same. I'm not even sure why I separated them. Oh yeah, I separated them because I wanted independent controls over them. Here I'm controlling it with macro 8, here I'm controlling it with macro 3. So let's hear what it sounds like without the LFO. And I can adjust the feedback here. Which essentially just makes it ring out longer. So I sometimes imagine this as like a plate. If you've ever seen a plate reverb, you actually send sound through a plate, it vibrates, and then you pick up that vibration. If you just tap it once, then it will still keep going for a while. And we can simulate this by turning up the feedback of a comb control. The damping is a filter which is inside of this comb circuit in a way, which just filters high end from the signal. It's not the most audible because we're just using sine waves, and sine waves don't have a lot of high frequency content above their root note, but it's fine. I'm going for subtle and weird here. So let's turn our LFO back again. And this is already sounding a bit more interesting. Now, why are we getting these clicks, these ba-ba-bow? This is because of the way our LFO shape is set. What is happening is it is going between these values. Whoops. It is going between those values, and since our LFO shape is not a pure up and down motion, but rather a mixture between those two, which means at some point it is coming down here and jumping back to its maximum value, which in the case of pitch modulation gives you clicks, because it's not a smooth transition. It is a do, 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 do. It can't do it otherwise. It's just, in a way, a side effect of this modulation, but I like the sound, so I went with it. And again, we can change this with our feedback control. So, but this sound in itself wasn't really what I was going for. So I liked the basis of what this comb filter was doing to the sound, but I wanted to process it even further. So that's why I'm sending it to our filter 2, which is the scream filter, one of the best filters of Massive, I think. One of the best software filters I still find to this day. So if we turn that one on, let's see what that sounds like. Nothing too exciting. For now, it still acts just like a normal low-pass filter. But the scream filter has some awesome things happening once you play with its resonance. So yeah, that's a pretty good start, I would say. But now, this needs to become a bit more, let's say, useful. So we have some interesting things going on, but I would still not put this in like a track, at least not without a lot more processing. So once you reach this stage of a preset design, then it's always a good idea to just try to see what it sounds like with lots of delay and lots of reverb. So let's do that. Okay, already much more useful, I would say. So now our sound, which was wobbly and had some weird clicks here and there, has become a sort of unsettling, unstable pad, or even drone if we were to play it in lower octaves. Just by the fact that all these wonderful artifacts that are happening are being stretched out for a long time through our, first of all, delay with generous feedback and our reverb. But we can still go one step further, and this is where our first insert comes into play. As a side note, anytime you're working with inserts, at least in Massive, it's always a good idea to check the routing, because where you put an insert can have pretty drastic effects on how it actually sounds. What I'm doing here is I'm telling Massive where to apply this insert. So right now it is being applied after filter 1, but before it goes into filter 2. I could also put it here, it would be the same. Since we're not dealing with feedback in this patch. Now why did I do this? I mean, you could hear it for yourself. If we put it behind filter 2, which is acting as our low pass filter to control the high end, then it will apply its processing after the signal has already been filtered, which I don't want. I want to affect this signal more before it gets low passed. For those who don't know, this is a sample and hold module, which in the analog world, a sample and hold module has some different functions. Your audio interface also has a sample and hold module. And anytime you have something random, it's most likely a sample and hold module. So it has to deal with how things are sampled. So it can pick a certain spot in a sample on like very micro scales, because it's all in the digital realm, it's all steps. And it can hold that specific value. In a sense, that means if you have a root node sitting at about 1000 hertz, then you have a lot of overtones going above 1000 hertz. And you can pick any of those spots, hold it, and just play it in a loop endlessly. So on high values, this tends to have a very sparkly, digital, 8-bit kind of sound, which can be very nice, and you can do a lot of things with that. In this case, I just used it to add a little graininess to what we already have. So can you hear how there's this tiny extra high-end shimmer going on top of our wobbly mid-range, I would say. So for this, we have this little V going on here, and the V is a velocity controlled modulator. You can find this over here. And basically what this means is this will react to how hard I'm playing my note. So if I'm playing it at a velocity of 0 to very low, you will hear almost nothing. If I play it harder, you will hear more of it. This again is totally optional. I added this to make the patch more playable. A lot of people actually like patches or presets that feel nice to play. And it's not just you get the exact same thing, regardless of how hard you hit it, if you play legato or not. So this just makes it a little more playable. And now I think we're basically done. The only thing I still had was a tiny bit of EQ being applied. I'll show you what it sounds like without. It just takes away a little amount of the mid-range because it's very dominant in this patch, and also it makes it, especially for film music, it helps having things sit more in the background, not being in the way of dialogue and all of that stuff. So if you can make sure that a patch is not overwhelmingly dominant in a mid-range to low mid-range, then it's always a good idea. But again, totally optional. So at this point, I was pretty much done with designing the patch, and the only thing that was left to do is to add a bit more functionality with some extra macro slots that we hadn't been using. I haven't talked about this one so far and about this one. This one, macro number 3, you can see is sitting here on the comb filter, again in sidechain mode. And now the amount of this, also if I do this and I activate the sidechain mode, then this disappears, because now this is not a modulator for our parameter, but rather our modulator for another modulator that we're using. So what this does is essentially does this. So by turning macro 3, I can control how much of this maximum modulation is supposed to be applied to a patch. And the last one that we have is this one. I called it Vibrato, but don't confuse it with this Vibrato that you get if you initialize a new patch. This macro is controlling the modulation amount of our initial LFO5 that does our pitch modulation. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I wanted to give the user the control to decide how much pitch modulation actually is supposed to be applied. One last thing I forgot to mention is I've had these turned off initially just to really focus on this unisono thing. But at the end of a patch, it's always a good idea just to check what would it sound like if all my voices were detuned just a little bit. I would say it opens up the stereo field even more and leaves more space in the middle. And we can do the same thing with our panning position. But I would say that is pretty much all there is to this patch. It's taken one little voice, multiplying it a few times, adding some wobbliness, filtering that wobbliness, and then extending that wobbliness. That is pretty much all there is to it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, then please leave them in the comments below. My name is Max Christensen from Observant Sound. And if you like this sound, I have a whole lot more like these in my Preset Pack District 0 Volume 2, which you can now get on my website, observantsound.com. I will be doing more tutorials like this, so if you like this and found it valuable, please subscribe to the channel. I would love to have you, and it's so inspiring for me to see people actually using the products that I make and being interested in the things that I do. And I would love to just work with you and make videos and products that help musicians like you out there to make your music. So that's all from me. Take care and see you in the next one.